Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today. My name is Jessica Unger, and I'm the Emergency Programs Coordinator of the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation, or FAIC. We're so pleased to be able to offer today's program as a part of a webinar series that addresses the needs of Alliance for Response communities and other cooperative disaster networks nationwide. These programs are made possible through the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We hope that you'll be able to join us for the other programs in the series, and you'll see that we have several sessions coming up later this month. We'll be addressing topics that are essential to cooperative disaster networks, including how to put together successful tabletop exercises, how to communicate effectively during an emergency, and how to successfully seek funding for your projects. Before we dive into the presentation, a couple of technical notes. On your screen, you'll see several boxes, including one labeled Chat on the left side, one labeled Web Links, and one labeled Files on the bottom. Use the chat box to say hello, ask questions, and share information. If you post a question, you'll receive a response either from me or my colleague, Tiffany Emig. Any questions will be noted, collected, and I will ask them of the presenter. To use the Web Links box, click on the link that you want to see in order to highlight it blue. Then click on the Browse To button to go to that site. In the Files box, likewise, click on the file that you want to download, and highlight it blue, then hit the Download File button. If you are unable to attend any of the upcoming sessions, don't fret. We will record all programs and host the sessions on AIC's YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/user/AI-conservation. It's more easily accessible via the web link box, which you can see below, and your first opportunity to test that out. And you note that actually the link will take you directly to the previous recordings for the past webinars in this series, and that link will be where you will find all future programming as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Alliance for Response initiative, I wanted to give a bit of context about the history and goals of the program. Alliance for Response began almost 15 years ago with a key mission in mind: to help communities more effectively protect their cultural and historic resources. The immediate objectives are to build relationships, initiating an ongoing dialogue between cultural institutions and emergency managers and first responders. To educate cultural heritage and emergency management professionals, working to raise awareness of the need to protect cultural and historic resources within communities, encouraging disaster planning and mitigation at archives, historic sites, libraries, and museums. And finally, to develop strong, ongoing networks to facilitate effective local response. Today's session really works to hit on all three of these goals. We'll be tapping into the knowledge base of emergency professionals to gain insights into the public assistance process, building relationships between our communities, educating ourselves, and developing those tools that can be helpful in building more effective networks in response. Many of you might be familiar with Alliance for Response as an initiative of heritage preservation, but in May of 2015, heritage preservation closed its doors. Fortunately, many of its programs transferred to the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation at that time. Alliance for Response and other emergency initiatives at heritage preservation joined forces with the emergency initiatives currently underway at FAIC, including the National Heritage Responders, formerly known as AIC CERT, a team of trained collections care professionals who provide on-the-ground support for impacted cultural heritage institutions. You can find out more information about the National Alliance for Response initiative and the existing networks by visiting our website at heritageemergency.org/AFR. Again, you can access the link by clicking on the web links box below. As those of you who have been through the public assistance process know, it can be somewhat difficult to decipher, especially when you're dealing with responding to and recovering from a disaster. So for today's program, we're so fortunate to be joined by Chris Holmes and our discussant, Rick Lord, who will help walk us through this process. Chris has been the Chief of Public Assistance Programs for the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, DHSES, for 13 years. DHSES administers FEMA disaster recovery programs in New York, and its portfolio for the Public Assistance Infrastructure Repair Program currently approaches $20 billion for various open disasters, with $16 billion related to Superstorm Sandy alone. Before moving to DHSES headquarters, Chris served as the regional director for 9 DHSES Hudson Valley and Catskill counties. Chris's work experience also includes logistics and management positions in the private sector, a 12-month stint at the United States African Command, AFCOM, in Stuttgart, Germany, and supporting emergency management professionals in developing nations through the Department of Defense's State Partnership Program. Chris has a BS from Union College in Schenectady, New York. Rick Lord is New York State Hazard Mitigation Officer and the Chief of Mitigation Programs for the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services in the DHSES, which administers FEMA disaster recovery programs in New York. Key mitigation projects include protecting critical New York City infrastructure using 9/11 funds, acquiring homes at risk for flooding with $128 million provided after Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, and resiliency projects utilizing nearly $1.5 billion in mitigation funding received as a result of Superstorm Sandy. Previously, he served as Deputy Chief of Public Assistance under Chris Holmes, our featured speaker today. Rick also spent 22 years with the New York State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, where he performed technical and compliance reviews for state and federal undertakings, including those funded by FEMA. Prior to that, he worked with low and moderate income property owners to rehabilitate neighborhoods around the New York State Capitol in Albany. He received a BS and BArch degrees from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York in 1981. Before I turn things over to Chris and Rick, we wanted to get a sense of who is on the webinar today. So to that end, we have just a few quick poll questions. First up, are you currently involved with an Alliance for Response network? Please go ahead and share your responses. Great, and I'll go ahead and broadcast the results. So it looks like not everyone chimed in, but of those of you who did, we have a majority who are currently involved with AFR, but quite a few who are not. So I hope that those of you who are not involved will consider either becoming involved with a local group or possibly even forming your own. Okay, next question. For those of you who are involved with an Alliance for Response network, are you familiar with those outside of your own region? For those of you who have joined us on previous Alliance for Response webinars, you'll recognize some of these slides and these questions as well, but it's really helpful to see who here is involved currently with Alliance for Response and your knowledge of others in other networks. So it's great to see that those who are involved do tend to have good lines of communication open with other networks. Another question. If you're here in the US, what region are you from? Generally the Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, Southwest, or West. Great, a lot of East Coast representation. And final question. Hopefully this is going up over. It's not seeming to. Oh no, it seems our final poll question. There we go, it's open now. Have you ever applied for public assistance after a disaster? So we're just curious who's familiar with this process. Great, thank you so much. So it looks like many of you have not had this experience before, so I think it's going to be very helpful for those who've never been through the process to learn a bit about what that looks like in order to make sure that you have all the appropriate information prepared. Great, well thank you all so much for your input on that. And with that, I would love to turn things over to our wonderful speakers for today, Chris Holmes and Rick Lord.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Holmes out of the lovely, warm and wet area of Albany right now, taking some of that southeast moisture here and enjoying it as it melts all our snow. For those of you that are familiar with our two colleges, this is one of the few times that you'll see a Dutchman from Union and an engineer from RPI actually collegially participating together, but we really do enjoy it and are looking forward to being able to walk you through the public assistance process. I'm going to warn you right up front that this stuff is indeed made out of governmentium, which means it's incredibly dense, it's awfully boring, and it has a moisture content right about halfway between sawdust and toast. But it is important, and it can capture you significant additional dollars after you have a disaster declared and help you recover from what happened to you.
Hey everybody, it's Rick. I'll chime in here. I'm the agency preservation officer in addition to running the mitigation programs. Obviously when bad things happen to our communities and we're dealing with applicants, our programs work well together because what mitigation does is make things bigger, better, stronger for the next time. And there's multiple ways that the FEMA program does, and we'll get into that. So anyway, it's very, very good to join folks here. You find the information helpful.
Alrighty, with that we'll kick off into and put you through what we call an applicant's briefing, and this is one we've actually given and presented after we received a federal declaration for some severe winter storms and flooding that we had in New York a couple of years ago. You'll notice it's labeled FEMA 4204-MY. Disasters that are declared get a federal number, and that's how they're referred to. Inside baseball, you hear a lot of folks talk about hurricanes by name or storms by name, but they're referred to in the federal parlance as the actual declaration number. That is supplemental. The key word here is we're not going to be able to do everything we'd like to totally rebuild you after an event. There are rules and laws that will prevent us from doing everything we'd like to, but we are going to work with our local, state, and federal partners to capture as much as we possibly can for you to help rebuild your facility and also repay you for emergency actions you've taken to protect yourself during the event. The process starts with getting the declaration, and then we're going to come out and do an actual damage assessment. And you should be looking for your county emergency manager. Should be reaching out to the county that you're in. Reach out to that county emergency manager and let them know that your facility experienced damages.
Yeah, and this is a good point. Consistent with the goals of the AFR, I mean, it's all about encouraging discussion and collaboration and understanding what happens before something bad actually does. So hopefully everybody knows who their point of contact is. We're going to give you a New York State-centric view, but most states would work this way as well. The whole process is really set up on the fact that most emergencies are local, and when the locals can't handle it, it's too large, the state steps in, and then similarly FEMA comes in when it's a large event and the state needs assistance. So, but it would be really important for institutions that haven't yet reached out or figured out who really would be their point of contact to start that dialogue, get someone into your place so they know what's going on, local fire departments, things like that as well. So having that information on your who to call list would be pretty important.
So once we get that information in and do a damage assessment with our federal partners, and we see that we meet the required thresholds, I won't bore you with what those are specifically right at this moment, we're going to go ahead and conduct an applicant's briefing in the declared counties. And this is another one where the notification will go out for a variety of means, but predominantly through the county emergency manager. And this is where we are going to invite everybody that thinks that they have sustained damages from the event and wants to get money. We invite them to come and hear what they have to do to get it, and this is what we're walking you through. You will then submit a request. We're going to come back and start rolling up our sleeves at a kickoff meeting and actually working to write projects. We're going to complete those projects. Don't worry about the phrase validation. That's an inside baseball kind of thing for us. And then the funds will get distributed. It says DHSES, but FEMA funds the state. And then once an applicant completes work and pays for it, the state will then reimburse the applicant for the actions they undertook, and we'll close out the project and hopefully have taken care of as much as we can. Couple key things here. We have a deadline for submission, and as we go forward and as there's a bigger crunch on federal dollars for everything, deadlines are becoming more and more important. So we have 30 days after we have had a disaster declaration to get your request for public assistance into the system. Now, we can request some extensions, we can provide extenuating circumstances, but the bottom line is if you get your request in early, you get services earlier and repaid earlier.
Yeah, and in our state, the request for public assistance is not, everything written up and everything evaluated. It's a form where you give basic information, express your interest, and maybe give some preliminary estimates. Then we'd sit down with you and go through very specific projects. If you're a community, they come and they tell us how many bridges and culverts and schools and hospitals at your facility. Hopefully it's contained, or you may have satellite offices in more than one location. But having the basic information, that would come later. So at least in New York, the request for public assistance, this 30-day deadline is getting the basic information in and making it known that you're interested in participating.
Absolutely. The next piece we're going to talk about is who is allowed to put in for a request for public assistance. We have restrictions on who can receive these federal grant funds. It's basically state agencies, county governments, city governments, and then the group that we're talking with now, and everybody's interested in this, certain private nonprofit organizations. And we're going to go into a little more detail on that in a slide or two. And the Native American tribes or tribal organizations. And you have to fit in one of these categories to hit that Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid that you see there and become an applicant. Oh, sorry, there. Private nonprofits. This is one where people get a lot of questions. Who is actually eligible as a private nonprofit to put in? Well, we break it down into two basic categories. You've got your critical PNPs, which are fire, emergency management, emergency medical services, hospitals, utilities, power, water, sewer, communications, and educational institutions. The good news is for these facilities or these organizations that are deemed critical is we're going to treat you just like you were a government. That can also be the bad news. We're going to treat you just like you were a government. But you get to apply directly for all of your categories of assistance to the federal government and receive funding for them. A lot of folks say, well, my educational institution is a private college. Doesn't matter. We can absolutely fund and pay for eligible damages to private educational institutions as long as they're part of the overall higher educational system. Non-critical PNPs include things like senior citizen centers, daycares, museums, zoos, libraries. And for those organizations, it's really critical that you work with us and look at your mission statement to show how you provide a service to the public. Sometimes we'll get folks that provide wonderful services to folks dying of cancer and kids and provide a lot of medical support to them, but they couch it in terms that it's a recreational camp, and then it becomes very difficult for us to be able to get them into the federal system. We've been successful in New York State before, but it requires you to take a look at what is it that you really do and what services do you provide. So it's critical to take a look at that as you get ready to go forward. Private nonprofit requirements that we have, you have to complete a whole package that includes things like your DUNS number. If you don't know what that is, that's your Dun and Bradstreet number. Bylaws for your organization, your mission statement for your organization, tax exempt letter, and then we evaluate. When I say we, it really is FEMA will evaluate and determine whether your private nonprofit is indeed eligible. And that's where, again, your mission statement becomes very, very critical to take a look at what it is that you do, especially for those non-critical private nonprofits like museums, libraries, zoos. Explain what your mission is and who it is that you're doing the outreach for. Sometimes sort of our PNPs are affiliated with religious organizations. We can still get those folks in as well, but you have to be able to split out how much of your organization provides services to the general public and how much of your organization and structure that was damaged provides strictly religious portions of education. So that's kind of a critical package there, and we'll help you fill that out and work that through with you. Next thing that comes up is your facility. Bottom line on this is you have to own it or be legally responsible. If you lease it, take a look at your lease and see what is it that I'm responsible for repairing. If you, as the person in the lease are responsible for fixing the damage, then the federal government can reimburse you for those repairs. Has to be in active use at the time of the disaster. Now, that means it can't be slated for demolition and tear down, but if you're using something that used to be, say, a school, but you're using it for storage, we can still do some repairs on that, but we can't make you back to school qualifications. We'll do the repairs based on bringing you back to the storage, the use that it was being accomplishing before the disaster occurred. The work we're going to talk about here, what can be done. We can do both what we call emergency work, which is basically removal of debris and taking those emergency protective actions to protect your facility either before or immediately after the incident that hits you. I'll use the example of a flood or a hurricane that's approaching. If you know that you're going to be flooded or you suspect it and you've taken sandbags and had folks come or paid a contractor to come and sandbag all around your facility and you rented a generator to be able to provide backup power generation, those would be emergency protective actions taken prior to the event. We can get you reimbursed for those. If immediately after the event all your records and your archives got soaked and inundated and you took immediate actions to prevent mold inside the facility and try to dry out and protect as much as possible, we can also pay you or reimburse you for those actions that were taken.
Yeah. There's one thing to stress here, though. The actions that you take before the storm hits, the sandbagging, things like that, that stuff would be eligible only if we actually get the presidential declaration.
That's right.
And there are a lot of times where, I mean, people assume that every time we have, you know, more than normally bad weather that we're going to get a declaration, and that's not the case. So, at some point, there's a balancing act. Obviously, bottom line and the value of the cultural material. Certainly, we really encourage everybody to do whatever they would do, whether or not FEMA is coming to town. But people do need to keep that in mind and understand that just because you do something when a storm is coming, it may not be reimbursable.
We have certain limits on how long we have to complete the work after we have the declaration. For the emergency work I talked about, removing your debris and taking those emergency actions, you get 6 months to get the work done, and your state can grant you another 6 months without having to ask approval from the Fed. So you get a total of 1 year from the declaration date. And then for permanent work, you get 18 months, and your state can grant you up to an additional 30 months. So a total of 4 years past that declaration date. If you can't finish the work within the 1 year or 4 years, then we have to make a request for FEMA with additional supporting documentation explaining why and timelines in order to get an approval for extension by FEMA. Approvals used to be much more readily granted for all good reasons. The federal government's taking a closer look right now at those extensions and making sure that we have reasonable timeframes associated and that we are actually really conducting the work rather than just kicking the can down the road on things that are difficult to bond and fund. A little bit more about that emergency work. Cleanup, removal, storage, and disposal of debris. And the definition of debris is real simple. Debris is something that wasn't there before the event, was caused by the event, and has to be removed. People ask me a lot of times, especially if you're in a coastal area, are boats or cars that got pushed in by the flooding debris? No, they're not. There's a separate process that covers that. You can be reimbursed for that as well. But because they're registered vehicles and there's legal procedures that need to be gone through, where they're not considered to be debris in the standard sense. And then we talked a bit about those emergency protective measures. Access, protection, emergency services, relocation of things, whether it be personnel, records, or important documents, artworks, things like that. If you know that you have to move it to get it out of harm's way and we have a declaration, we can probably get you some reimbursement for that.
And actually, Chris, could you speak about when communities can and can't remove debris from private property? I'm thinking some of these institutions may not, their community may have an opportunity to remove the debris for them.
Sure. Yeah. Generally speaking, you can't remove debris from private property. For example, if it's somebody's house and there's a bunch of stuff down in the backyard, trees down, the local government could remove it. They just can't be reimbursed for it. However, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, you'll often see folks that have taken their flooded, they take their trees that they've cut and they haul them to the curb, or they take all the rugs and carpets and drywall and insulation that's been flooded out and wet and they take it to the curb. The local government can indeed remove that debris that's brought curbside and be reimbursed for that. So they can provide that support to their government by, to the locals by doing that. Likewise, if your private residence has sole access and is blocked by debris, say you are along a driveway that's the only way in and it's a half-mile long and you can't get in because there's trees down, the local government can go in and cut those trees out for you and be reimbursed. But the bottom line is we can't pay the property owner directly. You have to be, remember that first slide of Maslow's pyramid there, you got to be the eligible applicant. Permanent work, don't worry about these categories. Basically, it means your roads, your bridges, water control, your building itself, the equipment inside of that building or outside of it. And then we have my favorite one, category G, all others. If we're not really sure what it is, but you own it, you maintain it, and you use it, and it's a permanent facility, we'll call it category G, other parks and recreation. Coming to the nuts and bolts of what's really important here is our project worksheet. And this is essentially the contract that you're going to sign and enter into with the federal government and state government that's going to give you the description or give us the description of the damage and the locations. We're going to capture whatever actual cost that you may or may not know at the time, and then for the cost that you're not sure of, we will use an estimation process using either some tools such as cost estimating format, you'll hear it referred to as CEF or RS means. We're going to write a comprehensive scope of work, and the bottom line in the scope is this should tell somebody exactly what it is that you're going to do and what the cost is for that, your estimated cost or your actual cost. Okay, it's really, really critical on this because I'm in government, I've got a BS, and everybody from government needs one of those. I also have an NUG. I don't know how many are familiar with that particular degree, but it means I'm not unusually gifted. And so 2 years after an event, somebody like me that's not unusually gifted needs to be able to pick up this project worksheet and understand what it is you intended and what the cost estimates were that you had on it. So take a good bit of time working on that, reviewing it, and making sure it's clear and easy to understand. Special consideration sheet, basically this is where we make sure that we don't violate any laws or regulations related to either historic preservation or the environment. And this is where we're going to capture those consultations and coordinations we need to do. And Rick could speak a little bit more to some of those.
Yeah, and we've got slides coming up about that. Yep. So this gives you a list of kind of the things that might be needed for a project worksheet. As Chris said, there's no contract per se, but the project worksheet is about as close as you're going to get to a contract. It's what FEMA agrees to fund, and it's run through the state. It speaks about the scope. It speaks about the materials. It speaks about the project limits. In a scenario with the highway department, you know, how many linear feet of road were damaged, how much riprap will be dropped. For an institution, it might be how many linear feet of wrought iron fence need to be repaired, things like that. So the bottom line is, you know, you're going to have to explain, people are going to evaluate the damage. The project worksheet is standalone, so anyone reading that should understand, you know, what the event is, what the damage is, what the fix is, the materials to use that. At some point, everybody doesn't wait. You may have done some work, whether it's emergency or you've actually started the permanent repair. So in those cases, you might have real receipts and real estimates, which is even, you know, a real quote, which is better than an estimate. So you may have already bought the materials that you need to patch the holes or fix the fence. So to the extent you have real numbers and real data, bring that along to the meeting because it only informs the project worksheet. But at the end of the day, all that stuff comes into play. What you're paying for staff, what you're paying for contractors, people you need to bring in, salaries, fringe, overtime, all that stuff is captured. And essentially, I mean, we keep saying that this is like a contract. If you stick to the scope and do the work, even if the estimate is off, even if FEMA said it's going to cost $56,000 and you spend $65,000, you will be reimbursed for the actual cost, not the estimate. And we get into numbers, there are threshold project worksheets, but as long as you stick to the scope, you'll be reimbursed.
We're talking about numbers here. There's two different ways that you can get paid, either by having a small project, which is any work that's going to be less than $123,100, or a large project is anything more than that. There are advantages to both ways of doing it. We'll explain those in a second or two here.
And it's important to stress that the federal government doesn't make you whole. The federal government, FEMA coming in, will reimburse 75% of the eligible expenses. In larger events, that can go up to 90%, but if you're planning on a regular event, plan for 75%.
Good point, Rick. Thank you. Small projects are written for your estimated or actual cost. In other words, if you know exactly what it costs you to rent that generator to provide power, we're going to pay you for the cost of that generator. But if you're not sure, if you're still doing some work and you believe it's going to be less than and reasonably less than that $123,000, you provide us a reasonable estimate or help develop one with your state and federal team, and we'll pay you on the estimated cost. Most states will pay, I don't say all of them, but the majority of states will pay that project based on the estimate in advance. The nice thing about a small project is if you have, it cost you, say you thought it was going to be $80,000 to do the work, but you actually were able to accomplish it for $68,000, you get to keep that additional funding. We're not going to come back to request you to reimburse the federal government or send the money back to the Fed. You get to keep it. If you have an overrun and it costs you more than the $80,000 estimate, we can capture those dollars for you, but there's a process we have to go through that's a bit challenging. We have to wait till you're done with all your work on all your small projects, then basically conduct an audit to see how much did you have in underruns on some, and does it balance the overrun.
Yeah, and that's why we say it's challenging. But the benefit to that, as Chris said, is at least here and in many states, a small project, you're going to get the money. You're going to get the money based on the estimate, even if you haven't completed the work or all of the work. And the thought process behind that is to get the money on the street and start jumpstart some of these smaller projects.
And you get to keep the small change that's left over. That doesn't mean you get to overestimate every project. They're going to watch you for that, but absolutely get to keep the reasonable estimate that you didn't spend. Large projects, again, written for estimated or actual, but the nice thing about a large project is if you don't know what the costs are going to be, we're going to give you an estimate. You're going to be paid for the actual cost of the work when you complete it, even if it goes over that estimate. So if your estimate was $258,000 to complete the work, you did everything in accordance with what your scope said, you followed all the laws, rules, and regulations, but the project cost came in at $348,000, we're going to pay you the $348,000.
So do you want to talk about the payments, or we cover that later?
We can cover it a little later. Some states do this and some states don't. In New York, we'll provide you progress payments for your project. So in other words, if you had that $258,000 project, and remember, this is a reimbursement. We pay you after you've completed and paid for the work. And if you have a $258,000 project and you've got $58,000 that you've completed and paid for, you can put a request in to us to have a progress payment, and we'll reimburse you for those $58,000. And in New York State, we'll walk you all the way up to the full amount that was obligated. And then if you've gone over, we have to wait until FEMA reviews our request for the additional funds, agrees with us, and provides those additional funds to us. We're going to talk about some inside baseball stuff that's a little boring, but very important as well. A lot of times when people are damaged by a disaster, they say, you know, I had a facility that only had one floor and I really needed two, and this is a great time since I'm rebuilding to add that second story. Terrific. Can you do that? Absolutely. Can you receive federal funding for that additional second story? No, because you're increasing the function and capacity. We restore you to what you were before as closely as possible with some other things we can throw in. But if you want to increase function and capacity, you can do that. However, we're going to cap you at the estimated cost to restore that single floor that existed prior to the event. So be careful when you decide you want to do an improved project, because if you have cost overruns in the original, it's too difficult to separate out from the improvement, the addition of the second floor, and you're going to wind up not being able to be reimbursed for that. It can be an effective tool, but you need to be careful.
Essentially, in an improved project, you live with the estimate. And another example is, a fire station or something that has two bays and they wanted the third. If the estimate is done based on restoring the two-bay function, and then everything above that is borne by the owner. So once that estimate is set, that's what you have to live with. So improved projects can be good if given certain circumstances, but it's something that, as Chris indicates, should be thought through pretty carefully. And folks in other states certainly talk with your public assistance officers and see what they recommend.
Alternate projects, this is where you have a facility that was damaged and you decide you want to do something completely different. You don't want to restore it at all. You can actually be reimbursed for a significant amount of funding to do something completely different. It's called an alternate project. Basically, you just have to service the same basic area and community that you were servicing before. I'll use an example where a local jurisdiction had a trail that included a railroad bridge over a creek. And it was an old bridge. It had been heavily damaged by the event. It was going to cost a couple of $1 million to be restored. They didn't want to do that because they'd had some significant problems and challenges with that particular bridge for a variety of reasons. They were allowed to abandon that facility. You render it safe and secure. They put up a couple Jersey barriers to prevent people from driving down. And then they said, can we take the funds that would have otherwise been used for that and repair the roof over our municipal pool, and I think they did some work on one of their libraries as well. And the answer was you absolutely can. You get a reduction in the total amount of funding available from FEMA, and for private nonprofits it's a bigger reduction than for local governments. But you'll get a slight reduction in the total amount of funding available, but the nice news is you can use it for all sorts of different things. Equipment, building a new facility someplace else, providing mitigation and to prevent damage at another facility in a different location that you own, all sorts of things open for you, and you can mix and match the things that you do.
It's pretty flexible. Yeah.
Insurance. This is one that I'm going to talk about. You have to obtain and maintain insurance after the event in the amount that the federal government gives you for the award. So if you have or you're damaged by severe winds, your roof is ripped off by a wind event, and you didn't have insurance in place the first time, FEMA is going to require you get the amount of funding that they paid you to replace your roof. If you have insurance in place the first time, they're going to say, okay, what did your insurance company pay you? They're going to reduce whatever FEMA would have paid you by the amount you received from your insurance. We will pay the deductible to you. We'll always pay the deductible, but we will reduce it by the amount, reduce the award by the amount of insurance you would have received. There's a slightly different thing with floods. More than slightly different. Floods, you have to obtain and maintain flood insurance. If you don't have flood insurance in place at the time of the event, FEMA is going to tell you that they have to, and they do by law, reduce you by the amount you would have received had you had an NFIP policy. In other words, we're going to pretend you had a policy in place and reduce you by the amount you would have received from that standard policy, which generally is $500,000 for the facility and $500,000 for the contents of the facility. We can and will pay, even if you didn't have flood insurance, for those items that would not have been covered by a standard flood insurance policy. Lots of stuff that's located subgrade is not insurable under a flood insurance policy, and those items that exceed the 500,000 contents and 500,000 for the facility itself would be covered by FEMA. But you will be absolutely required to obtain and maintain insurance for that, and you're going to be required to show that proof of insurance when we go to close the grant. Otherwise, we can't refund you.
Yeah, I mean, the thought process behind this is obviously they want to, FEMA, the federal government considers themselves the last place to go for assistance. They'd rather have you do insurance and things like that. So that's why the first bullet, that you need to carry insurance is the same really for the flood insurance program. FEMA is the actual agency that runs that program. So when people don't carry policies, there aren't premiums coming in and there's bigger hits on the system. So that's why the requirement is there. So it might be a good thing for folks to check with their insurers, their carriers, and see what they're covered for, what their deductible is, and what happens if you're in or near a floodplain, what coverage you have and what you're eligible for.
One of the things we're always going to look at is called hazard mitigation. There's two types. There's the hazard mitigation that my colleague's Rick's program manages, called 404. That's a section of the Stafford Act. Basically, everything we're talking about in here is allowed and called for under the Stafford Act. So this is the mechanism that we use to be able to get the funding. The other mitigation is called 406, and that's covered under my program. This is the easiest mitigation to get because all you have to do is be an eligible applicant and have been damaged by the event. And basically, we can put additional funding into your project to make it bigger, better, faster, stronger so that we don't have to come back the next time the flood or the windstorm comes along and hits you. We can do all sorts of things fairly easily. If the overall mitigation proposal that you have, say you see this road here with a culvert that's undersized that rips it out, if you want to put some wing walls in and upsize that culvert, and it costs 15% of the overall restoration, it's going to cost me $100,000 to build the new one, and I can put $15,000 of upgrade size, that can be approved right there in the field by the FEMA staff. We can go up to 100% of that damage if it's on a pre-approved list from FEMA, and they're working to expand that list, which we really like to see. And we can even go above and beyond that. It's like the Ronco commercial, but wait, there's more. We can go above and beyond that by conducting a benefit cost analysis to see if we have a lot of history of disaster damages there, and we can pay more than the cost to restore that project. We can go up to whatever shows that benefit of at least one. And I'll let Rick talk a little bit more about that because that's starting to wander into his world of the 404 dance.
Yeah, but before I get to that piece, I mean, the beauty of the Stafford Act is that it's really very forward-thinking and very comprehensive. And as Chris mentioned, the goal is to not come back. The goal is to break the cycle of disaster damage. So if you have a culvert or any kind of a facility, and it may not come into play quite so much with not-for-profits, but obviously the baseline is really to get you back where you were before. But if there are new codes and standards that have come into play since that facility was built in terms of egress or things like that, that's covered as well. You can do a codes and standards upgrade to make it, bigger, better, stronger, bring it up to code, make it safer. You can also do mitigation under Chris's program, as he's talking about. It generally has to be tied to the damaged feature. And then on top of that, there's the hazard mitigation grant program, which I run. And the good news is if you're determined as a private nonprofit to be eligible for public assistance repairs, you're automatically eligible for the HMGP. And that pool of money is established as a percentage of what FEMA spends in the overall disaster. So if you remember from the introductions, my HMGP for Sandy is almost $1.5 billion. It's an immense event. It's a huge pot of money, but it lets us, so it is capped in a way, and it is competitive, but it lets you go even above and beyond the damaged part of your facility to make the overall site or building or warehouse, laboratory, conservation labs stronger. So you can do codes and standards. You can, when you're actually doing the repairs, you can make that part more robust, and then you can add more mitigation measures at other places in the building or on the site. And so it's a pretty comprehensive approach to to repair and getting back on your feet. And the goal is that we don't have to come back. You don't have to suffer through this again. So that hazard mitigation grant program, as I said, the pot is established based on a percentage of the money that FEMA gives to the state. The state has a hazard mitigation plan. Every state has one, or they couldn't get any of the monies that we're telling you about. So no matter where you're calling from, your state has a plan. In New York, we do countywide hazard mitigation plans as well, where all the jurisdictions, all the communities participate, and cultural institutions are invited to participate as well. So you might want to check with the county and talk and see what your mitigation plan covers. That could give you some ideas if your site is or your library is hit by a flood or some other event. There might be some things in the plan that give you ideas on how you can make it stronger the next time around. And to the extent that you're consistent with a local plan and consistent with a state plan, you do better in the ranking process because the state sets priorities and then the local jurisdiction set priorities.
And the nice thing about, and I'll go back to my side of the house, the nice thing about the 406 mitigation, we're not competitive. If you're damaged, you're eligible for 406 mitigation for your permanent work. You don't need to have a plan. Your state doesn't even need to have, well, your state does have to have a plan to get to get public assistance. Yeah. But you don't have to have a county plan and don't have to be participating in a plan in order to be able to get 406 mitigation. And we're not capped. We're not capped for the disaster or for the project. As long as the BCA is met, we can keep adding mitigation to your project and we can keep adding mitigation to the overall disaster. Codes and standards are not considered to be mitigation. So if you have to build to meet codes and standards, outstanding, we're going to pay you, reimburse you for that. And if you have something additional above and beyond those codes and standards that makes sense, we'll add that to it. So it's a great program. You can tell we're both pretty excited about it because we love getting the money in there up front. We really do dovetail and work together on this, and we love not having to come back and see you in the future so you don't have to listen to this kind of presentation ever again.
Yeah, and every dollar Chris spends makes my pot bigger, so it all works. So other special considerations, and that's kind of a catch-all. I think there's 8 or 9 or maybe as many as 10 questions now. It's the things kind of above and beyond, the things that might trip somebody up and the things that FEMA needs to consider and take into account as they develop the worksheet and get you into a place where we can fund your rebuilding. Under special considerations, we've already covered insurance, and that's one of those things, whether it's in a floodplain or not, just traditional standard insurance. EHP stands for Environmental and Historic Preservation. As a federal agency, FEMA needs to worry about wetlands and endangered species and all the other things that people are aware of these days, as well as the historic and cultural environment and things that are on the National Register of Historic Places or things that have tribal significance. So EHP covers essentially the natural and the built environment and impacts that these projects can have to that. We do protect, restore, enhance that natural and built environment. The National Historic Preservation Act, 1966, that's probably one of the larger ones that folks know besides the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Those really are the two heavy hitters. Endangered species can come into play depending on where your facility is. But again, know anything that you know up front. If you know your site is on the National Register or local state register, bring that information along when you start talking about a project worksheet for your damage. You folks are probably better attuned to a lot of this stuff than most, but generally structures need to be more than 50 years old. There can be exceptions for something that's the work of a master or an extremely rare type, and things can have local, state, or national significance as well. And it's not just buildings. As you see from the list, it can be landscapes, it can be bridges. One of the rides at Coney Island is on the National Register. So it's a variety of things. We even have an Art Deco water treatment plant down in Westchester County. So, but again, I think that many of the folks on the line are perhaps more attuned to what might be historic and what needs special care, and that's why you're on here anyway.
And the nice thing about the EHP provisions are if you're required by your State Historic Preservation Office or Tribal Historic Preservation Office to conduct actions or add different materials or make it look like it looked before, the cost of that is considered a regulatory requirement, and the cost of that become eligible. And here we are talking about cost. As you see, this is the tip of Maslow's pyramid, which is supposed to be the most self-actualized and easiest to get to, or least important to get to. Anybody out there think that this one hasn't been getting bigger and bigger as the years have gone on? I doubt there are. This is becoming a little more scrutinized, but we have wonderful phrases like reasonable and necessary. Reasonable is kind of what's reasonable to me in New York might not be reasonable to somebody in Wyoming as far as cost to work on a road. The big thing we have to do is be able to show that we attempted to get it done for the most reasonable price available. So if we'll talk about procurement, if we put out bids and we got 5 bids and we picked the low bid, that's probably going to be considered to be reasonable by FEMA. We have to make sure we comply with all federal, state, local laws and regulations when we're doing this work, to include procurement and bidding. We're going to talk about that. You keep hearing me come back to that. We have to offset by insurance, and purchase discounts have to be deducted if we've got them. And equipment costs are usually reimbursed, that's your trucks, your other types of vehicles and equipment, at mileage or hourly. Half day or more gets you a full day, and I'll talk about this for just a second. Less than half day equals actual hours. I tell my applicants, pick the one that's going to be most advantageous to you. You're going to have to stick with it. We're not going to mix and match, and one week you're getting mileage, and the next week you're looking for hourly. So we'll walk you through that process as well. Oops, there. Procurement. This is one you're going to hear me talk about. You got to comply with all federal, state, and local procurement requirements. And one of the things that is really getting scrutinized by those Office of Inspector General folks, and remember, this is their field of dreams. We have built it, they will come. They're going to come and take a look, and they're going to make sure you procured appropriately within your own local or your own procedures for your organization, as well as your local and state and federal laws. Specifically look to the minority women business enterprises. You've got to look to MWBE and make sure you're following those requirements. You also have to make very, very sure that if you're going out for no bid, you know, it's an emergency, I would strongly encourage you to take a look and see if you have procedures that define how and when you do that, and make sure that you're following those procedures. If you don't have them now, get them in place.
Yeah, this is that's what I was going to cover or discuss now. This is a good point for that, because it is, I mean, the whole mantra is really follow your own process. So you can have, we can have two local governments side by side, and one allows up to a month for no bid as long as they've declared an emergency, and one only allows 2 weeks. And FEMA is going to hold them to their policy. So they're side by side. They have different standards. One has to stop after 2 weeks. The other can continue to go no bid for an additional 2, because it's what they have set down as their procedures and law. Depending on, you know, we have large and small institutions. We have people that are very sophisticated and have developed plans, and we have folks who rely on volunteers and aren't open as often. So this would be a good time to look at procedures, maybe even go online, see what other, you know, work within networks to see what other museums, libraries, and things have in place if you don't have something, or kind of benchmark it and see what makes sense to change on yours. So look to set some of these things down in print before something bad happens, and you're in a little better place in terms of what you might do in terms of procurement, if you have folks on call, what you can do without going to bid, things like that.
Next piece, we'll talk about labor and materials. So you can either have force account, which includes your fringe benefits. For the emergency work, debris removal and those emergency actions we talk about, we're only going to give your permanent employees their overtime, because they would have been working for you during the day anyway. Temporary employees are going to get regular and overtime, because you had to bring them in special just for this event. For permanent work, the good news is, if it's your force account, your own employees, we're going to pay both the overtime as well as the regular time, because the only reason they're doing that work is because of the disaster event. And we can include travel and per diem for those employees performing those eligible activities. You can take materials out of stockpiles, or you can go and buy them. You have to use them for eligible work. And document. You know, we're going to reimburse you for the cost to replace those materials, or the cost that you pay to have those materials put into your stockpile. So that's how we're going to work that. Donated resources. This is usually, for the most part, only eligible for your category A and B emergency work, and this is when folks come and donate pretty much labor or, you know, equipment to take care of something. And we can offset your non-federal share. We can't pay you for volunteers because you don't pay your volunteers, but we can absolutely help reduce that 25% burden that's on you, and we'll calculate a credit for that, and FEMA will reduce the overall cost to you to have done that work. So you can get a credit for those donated resources.
Yeah, so if you have a friends group or a volunteer group, people who help support your site, and you bring them on board after a flood or other event, make sure you have sign-in sheets, make sure you keep track of their time, their hours, and that kind of thing. It'll make the process all the more easy.
Contracts. We're going to talk about some types of contracts that are absolutely great and some that are pretty awful. Lump sum contracts, absolutely allowed to be utilized. Again, remember, procure appropriately for all of these. It's easy to monitor, and it works well because you don't have to really document and take care of all the quantities. Time and materials contracts, please be careful with these. FEMA will give you up to 70 hours on these and then want you to rebid to a different type of contract, and you absolutely have to have a cap and monitor the work. And that makes good sense, because if you think about it, no contractor has ever tried to take us to the farm by just taking a lot longer to get something done and saying he's doing something when they're not. We actually put several contractors in jail in one of our major debris events in Buffalo who were trying to falsify load tickets for the removal of debris. Ineligible contracts, these are the kiss of death. You cannot enter into these. If you do, you will not be paid. Cost plus percentage of cost contracts. There is absolutely zero incentive for your contractor to keep his costs down, and the federal government and state government, if they're paying anything into this, have zero desire to support that. The other ones are debarred contractors. There's a debarred contract list in pretty much every state, and the federal one as well. And you cannot do business with them, otherwise you will not be reimbursed. And what I like to call the wimpy contract. For disaster work today, I will gladly pay you on a Thursday. If you say that your contract is dependent or in any way, shape, or form linked to FEMA coming to town, That is the kiss of death, and you will not get reimbursed. So be very careful when you enter into your contracts. Project notification, this is when we send you, when FEMA sends to you, the notice that says, hey, we've looked at your project worksheet. We're going to obligate, which is we're going to say we're going to give the state to release to you on reimbursement up to this amount. We're going to send a form that's a project completion form along with it, bunch of stuff. Read that project worksheet carefully. Make sure it looks like what you think you submitted, because sometimes they change. And we're supposed to notify you and let you know and make you aware, but sometimes this doesn't happen. So if one of these things does not look like what you signed and agreed to, and there's a problem, you've got 60 days to throw the coach's challenge and let us know that it needs to be corrected and appeal that project worksheet's written determination of what we're going to do for you.
Yeah, and usually, at least here, when you get a booklet like that in New York State, and I have to assume everyone operates the same way, you'll know who to contact. It'll tell you who to contact. But remember, when you sat down with folks to give them all that information so that they could write the project worksheet, sometimes it's a FEMA state team. Sometimes, depending on the scale of the event and how complex the projects are, they may split up, and you may only be dealing with a FEMA person or a state person. But because of the way the system works, you really want to have a name and a phone number for one or two state people, and they would be your point of contact. You wouldn't go to FEMA because, again, think about, not-for-profits and local governments working up through the state, and then the state working with FEMA. So at some point, though, you sat down, you gave them that information. If the project worksheet doesn't look like it incorporates all that or is somehow different than you expected, give those people a call, sit down and go over it line by line, and get to a good place. It's kind of losing my voice. There.
All right, and here's one that's important for us. Funds can be at risk when you don't as an applicant, because like I said, this is dense and complex, and we're just skimming the surface for you. You need to ask questions. Ask questions during your applicant's briefing. Ask questions during your kickoff meeting. Ask questions when FEMA's writing your project worksheet for you, and ask questions when you get it back or you're getting paid. You need to follow your contract procurement procedures. This is getting huge. I'm seeing a lot of OIG interest in this now. Follow your scope of work. Do what you say you were going to do. If you need to change your scope because you ran into something that you didn't anticipate, you can. But you got to let the state and federal government know in advance that you've run into the issue and get their approval to do the work before you start making that change. Get your permits. Coordinate with your SHPO. When we say ensure administrative continuity, if you're getting ready to retire, don't do what one little mayor in a village did for us and leave a bunch of stuff literally in a brown paper bag that said FEMA stuff for his follow-on mayor who opened it up about 8 months after he should have turned a bunch of stuff in. So make sure that you brief your relief, as we like to say. Keep your records complete, clear, and accurate right from the minute you start doing the work. Whether or not FEMA is in town, don't wait for us to come to do what you need to do, but record what you did. And then meet the deadlines. Work with your federal and state staff to make sure that you're meeting the deadlines, because it makes it a lot easier for us to make sure that you get paid.
Yeah, and depending on the size of your institution, you may or may not have a robust staff, but the skill sets that people need in this process are, if you have someone who's your facilities point of contact, or they're in charge of a facility, or they're your go-to person for how to keep the building and the site up. You also, obviously, there's a large fiscal component, so you want those folks involved. And if you have anyone with project management experience, or even just a third person who kind of real good at administration, that might become your team on a smaller project at a smaller site. But all those things come into play, and having more than one person involved does help to ensure that continuity.
And then basically where you get the additional information, your first point of contact is going to be your FEMA state team that's there working to write those projects up. Well, they're what they call their joint field offices open, which is generally for around, they try to make it as quickly as possible, but usually 90 days is the minimum amount of time you'll see a joint field office open. Your county emergency manager, you've heard us talk about them a bunch of times. They're very critical components to making sure that you're identified when something happens. Your state emergency management website as well. Most states have one, and that's ours. FEMA's website. They've got a bunch of policy digests that we can talk about, and Rick's tossed on our Parks State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service are all great contacts and links.
Yeah, and also Jessica loaded some good documents. Many of the FEMA documents are here on the file section for people to download and open. Also, again, this was a brief prepared for our state, but the links on the web links include all the states for your state emergency management agencies. So our counterpart agencies in your state, you should be able to find there. There's also the Secretary of the Interior standards for everything from reconstruction to whatever, and then the rehab standards are the ones that are used in the Section 106 review for the National Historic Preservation, and then there's the Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. So those links should help you find counterpart agencies in your state that do what we do. Yeah,
and one thing I'd like to bring up, you'll see the policy digests and the other things listed under FEMA.gov. That's all been consolidated into a new public assistance, they call it the Papa G, a new consolidated policy guide that gets all the policies and fact sheets and everything gathered up under one. But the FEMA website will take you to that and give you the latest and greatest. There hasn't been huge changes, but a few shifts, and that's where you're going to get that.
So we can get a more updated link to Jessica and to distribute. So I'm seeing there's a couple folks that wanted us to talk about some things. People mentioned the Stafford Act. I'm not quite sure what folks had in mind, but again, the Stafford Act is from the 70s. Pretty much everything that the federal government brings to bear after an event is spelled out there. Everything, from business assistance, things that enable SBA to do what they do, individual assistance where many homes are destroyed or severely damaged. We can have individual assistance covered under the declaration so that people can call that 1-800 number to register and get assistance to help with lost possessions and home repairs. That's a program that doesn't begin to bring people back to where they are. But also under the Stafford Act is, the public assistance program, which we've talked about, and then the hazard mitigation program that I run. And again, that pot is a percentage of all the infrastructure repair funds and the monies to individuals. There's crisis counseling. There's many smaller components that people aren't aware of, but the Stafford Act covers many of the response. It's a good mechanism that allows the feds to really help on many levels and in many ways. So I don't know if that answers folks' questions. And Lori had mentioned, someone else had another question too. Oh, would we consider an AFR chapter a PNP? That's not really a determination that we'd make. That's a FEMA determination. But again, you'd need if you haven't got an IRS letter, you'd have to see if you qualify that way, either a 501c or a D or an E IRS determination.
Yeah, the big thing to remember is basically for private nonprofits, and I'll share, it's a challenge with private nonprofits oftentimes. The criticals are very easy determination. We don't have any problems. But our experience in Sandy, where we have more than 9,000 private nonprofits in the greater metro area, many of whom provide some complex services or some complex links to provide services to the New York City government, we had a real challenge on figuring out what they were doing, who they were doing it for, how they were doing it. The bottom line is you have to provide some type of service to the general public that's of a governmental nature. And so the key word there really, or the key phrase is to the general public. So if your organization, however it's configured, can show us that it does that in their mission statement, in their bylaws, and how they're structured, and their explanation of what it is that they do, then we can probably get you into at least some support. One thing I didn't bring up about private nonprofits is for those critical ones, like I said, we treat you like government, we can pay you for everything. For the essential but non-criticals, I'll use a museum or a zoo for an example, we can pay you for those emergency protective actions and debris removal actions that you undertook, but for damage to your facility and equipment, we are required to have you go to the SBA first and request a low-interest loan. And every time a major disaster is declared, the SBA loan program is open to the private nonprofits for that disaster. If SBA denies your loan, You take that denial letter, you show it to us, we show it to FEMA, and then we can reimburse you for the actions that you're going to take to fix your facility and repair your equipment. But you have to go to the SBA first and be denied before we can do more than that debris removal and emergency action type stuff.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about that hazard mitigation grant program that comes along. Remember, I said under public assistance, if you're deemed an eligible applicant to get your facility repaired, you're automatically an eligible applicant under the hazard mitigation grant program. The requirement would be that you're in a community that's covered by a mitigation plan, a FEMA approved mitigation plan. They last for 5 years. If you're in New York State, most of our counties have them, and the state has a plan. So that's the way that would work. The state sets priorities in its plan, and also for each grant cycle, it can set priorities. And where that comes into play, if you think about an event that's a flood event, perhaps the state's priorities would include, number one would be removing houses from floodplains or elevating houses that are at risk. And so based on the event, that can really set the stage for how the state establishes its priorities.
I see there's a question regarding your hours of operation. There's nothing that I've ever seen in any FEMA guideline that defines when your hours of operation need to be in order to meet the requirements as an eligible private nonprofit. I can think of instances where maybe that they've got some organizations that may be open well after the standard in the attempt to get youths off the street and into productive learning environments and provide cultural resources, education, and opportunities for at-risk youth that might be open in the midnight hours. That could be something that could be well argued as a eligible private nonprofit.
And Lori, you had mentioned the 5% initiative. That, again, comes under my program. We get that pot of money. The state establishes its priorities, whether it's buying properties or focusing on communications or transportation or emergency infrastructure. I can give you some examples from Sandy. We've replaced 106 bridges in New York State that were subject to scour. Many years ago, we had a thruway bridge that collapsed, and I think about 10 people died in that. So we're very concerned about that, obviously, and so we've identified, using federal highway standards and with state DOT, we actually replaced 106 bridges. We're also building a statewide, it's called a MISONet. It's a weather monitoring station that does just about everything. I mean, we have 125 stations pretty much in a grid across the state. 17 of them have LIDAR, 2 or 3 miles into the clouds to tell you what the precipitation is going to be. When that's up and running, that's going to give us really good data to give it advance warning and to let people understand what's coming. So that's the kind of thing on a large event where the dollars are large, and to take advantage and do things that we haven't been able to do before. Smaller events, sometimes it's communities, roads that wash out, making sure that evacuation routes are safe, kind of continuity of government. So depending, again, encourage everybody to look at to find out how you're covered by a mitigation plan. If you're in our state, you're covered by a county plan. Many larger jurisdictions, larger cities, parishes may have a plan also, but see who's covered you and what their priorities are, what's established, because and work with them if you have something that you think needs to happen either at your facility or in your neighborhood, because maybe they missed something, and so those plans, once approved by FEMA, can be updated. And if you're listed in the plan, you kind of have a leg up on the ability to get funded for a project after a disaster declaration.
And Tammy, I see you've got a question on the private college libraries. A private college library would qualify as a critical part of a critical facility because it's part of the private college. So that's the good news. You're going to get treated as a government. That library is part of that college. It wouldn't even have to be open to the general public as long as that's an accredited institution. So like, for example, my alma mater, Union College, if they got horribly devastated by a flooding event and their library was damaged, they would be reimbursed for all the actions they took to repair their library, even though it's not open to the general public and the folks from Schenectady aren't wandering in wherever they feel like.
So, Jess, or folks on the other end, do you think of anything we've missed or should cover?
Well, I just wanted to jump in at this point and say thank you to you both for your eagle eyes and keeping an eye out for the questions that were coming in the chat window, and likewise, thank you to those who have already asked them. I want to encourage anyone at this point who had questions about any of the content covered, to go ahead and share those in the box there. And I also want to go ahead and give a quick shout out to Lori Foley, who's with FEMA and the Smithsonian, who has very graciously provided the link for the new public assistance program and policy guide that was mentioned. So you all can see that in the chat window, and I went ahead and uploaded it into the web link box as well. But thank you for giving some more definition to the PMP question that Carl had regarding AFRs, and of course for talking a little bit more about the Stafford Act. I did see that Glenda had a follow-up question, which I'm not sure was fully addressed, about policy guidelines that specify things like having specific hours, and just wondering if, not specifically when, but just that you have some specifically communicated days and hours of operation.
Again, this would be, I don't believe so. I've never seen that as a requirement.
Or have it be an issue if someone...
Yeah, the only way I would see it as being an issue is if somebody from FEMA, as they were getting ready to write your project worksheet, or somebody from the state, if they were getting ready to write your project worksheet, was hearing, well, they say they're a PNP, but they're never open anytime I go there. They don't have published hours, or we go and there's nobody there. But that's not any part of any policy that I've ever seen.
Yeah. I mean, the objective for the PMP is to provide a government-like service to the public. So if you're hardly ever open, you may get a question.
Yeah, the most critical thing is really your mission statement, your bylaws, and what it is that you do. Being able to clearly show how you provide some type of service to the public that's of a governmental nature.
Right, great, thank you for that. And Lori just jumped in to say that there might be language that's used with Institute of Museum and Library Services grant applications that require minimum number of hours open to the public. So perhaps that's where that thinking comes from. So I see there's a little bit of action happening in the chat window, so we'll just hold on a little bit longer to see if any other questions come in. And I want to remind everyone that you should all be able to, as a participant in this webinar, be able to, if you want to click on any of the links that are included in the presentation itself, they should be able to take you to those sites that are currently up on this final slide of Chris and Rick's. And I think we might end up wrapping a little bit before the end of our hour and a half. Okay, so Donna was just jumping in with another thought on this, that public libraries wouldn't have difficulty demonstrating that they perform a public service. And there was a little back and forth.
Yeah, Donna's absolutely right. There's never a problem with a public library. The only issue we have is sometimes the libraries, especially in our rural communities, will not realize they have to apply to the SBA to get their, to see if they can get a loan to repair their facility or the other permanent work categories for their major equipment. So they just need to make sure they do that. But public libraries are never an issue.
Yeah, I mean, really, if there's one thing to take home, two things, sorry. Know in advance who you look to for this information. How is information disseminated in your state about a disaster declaration? In New York, we put the information out on our webpage. We push it out to our regional offices, to the declared counties, and those counties help set up the applicant briefings. It may be slightly different in your state, but you want to know who to call to say, or what webpage to check to see if there's a presidential disaster declaration a day or two after something major happens in your area. The other piece is get that request for public assistance in, no matter how it works in your state. In our state, it's a one-page form. That's the 30 days, and that's your interest. That shows that you have interest, that you want to do it. From that point on, they'll be contacting you and setting up the meetings and doing things. But getting that paper in is key, because as Chris said, we've years ago it was really easy for FEMA to extend things. Now people are tightening belts, making sure rules are met, that projects, as you said, we're not kicking the can, we're spending the federal money quickly, efficiently, and doing the right thing. So just get the paperwork, the very first piece in at the right time, and then they'll be calling you for to get in touch. And
that request, and sometimes people get really a little twitchy about that request for public assistance because it asks for a POC, and they're afraid that it obligates you to do something. It doesn't. You can withdraw it at any time if you decide you don't have damages or you don't want to seek reimbursement. There's no harm, no foul. go ahead and put it in. We'll take a look at it, and then we can work with you. But if you don't put it in, we don't know you exist.
Yeah,
we literally have no ability to work with you until we get that.
You want to get your foot in the door, but you can always pull it out. So.
That's a great point, definitely. Liz is wondering, are there extensions granted in circumstances where there is a widespread disaster in a specific area and FEMA and local agencies are overwhelmed?
Absolutely. We did that for Sandy. We got several extensions for the RPA deadline simply because of the massive amounts of damage, and in the incredibly dense urban area would have made it almost impossible for us to get these RPAs in within 30 days.
Yeah.
So we will, and your states will work to extend that when we can. But I use the same basic rule of thumb. We're all, we're kind of bureaucrats, so pieces of paper hit our desks, and the piece of paper that got there first is probably the one that's going to be actioned first. So, we know you're going to get overwhelmed, but we'll work with you. And even if the deadline's passed, I would encourage you to still submit your RPA, because if you have a good enough reason, we'll work with, and every state I know will work with you and work with FEMA to get you included. It's not to our interest to exclude anybody from these reimbursement processes, and our friends from FEMA have been very good when we've worked with them one-on-one. I got a local volunteer fire department that just for whatever reason didn't realize they should have applied, and I was able to get them in a full 2 years after the actual declaration date of Sandy, because we would have gladly done everything had they known. They didn't. We found out why, and we still got them in.
That's great. So Tammy has a question as well. She's wondering if you can talk about public assistance for recovering cultural heritage collections, for example, archival and manuscript collections, museum objects, etc.
That's a good question. There's a couple different pieces in place there. We can reimburse you for a lot of actions needed to protect or restore those resources. We can't pay you for the replacement of those resources. I can't go out and get you another Van Gogh because your Van Gogh was destroyed by the flood, and FEMA can't reimburse you for that. But if, for example, you have archived materials, historic photographs that require protection,
You got to freeze
drying them, or transferring them to another medium so at least the visual image is still there, because they're going to deteriorate too rapidly or in some way, shape, or form, we can usually get a significant amount of funding for reimbursement for those actions. So it's going to require some additional detail and work, but if it comes to protecting or restoring from the event, we can usually reimburse you. If it comes to replacing from the event, we generally can't, and that's where you're going to be looking towards your insurance policies to ensure that you've got adequate coverage for those.
Yeah, but that raises a good point to talk about mitigation again, because if you think about where the materials were stored, what they are, what they're susceptible to.
Basements are bad.
Yeah, I mean, think about, we're not going to put them in the same place. Do we build an addition on the back, and is the cost of that an eligible mitigation expense? Or some other rehabilitating some other part of the facility at a higher elevation that's not in current use, or shift some things around. Some of that work might be eligible as mitigation so that we can protect the manuscripts, the collections, and again not have to do this repeatedly.
Great question, Tammy. Thanks for raising that, and great response, Chris and Rick. Really, a lot of people on the webinar really appreciate those insights. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I want to go ahead and take the opportunity now to just once again remind everyone about the upcoming programs happening in this webinar series. In the files box down on the bottom part of the screen, you can download the promotional flyer for the full series. I encourage you to share this with anyone who might be interested in these topics. They were designed for Alliance for Response Networks in mind, but we will welcome anyone who's interested. I'm going to go ahead and also just pull over a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. Please just take a few moments to fill out. It's a brief 10-question survey, but the information is incredibly valuable to us in shaping future programming. So I want to take the time to once again thank everyone for joining us today. You all had really excellent questions and insights, And of course, a special thanks to our wonderful presenter, Chris Holmes, and our discussant, Rick Lord. You both have a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and we're so grateful that you were able to take the time to share that with us.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you guys for letting us bore your socks off. I think you'll agree. I was right. Sawdust and toast.
It's dry, but we appreciate it.
Well, I think it's so important for everyone to have this information up front rather than trying to decipher all of this after the fact. So I hope everyone will take away from this program the importance of lining up your sources of information, so knowing where to go to for declaration info and getting all your documents and everything else in order. I want to give one final shout out to our funders, National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you for making this series possible. I want to say thank you to everyone once again. Have a wonderful Thursday, and we hope to see you at our next session, which will happen a week from today on Thursday the 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again, Rick. Thanks again, Chris.
Nada. You're welcome.
Rick Lord
has left the conference.